You'll see is that this clip is a lot shorter than this one. That's because this car is just going to be passing by screen. It means I don't need that clip to be as long as the entire background. Now, one thing I want to make sure is that my cars are slightly offset. It's going to look a little weird if both of my cars are passing each other in frame at the exact same time or position on the road. So what I'd like to do is offset this so that the red car animation won't begin until somewhere around 2 seconds. Or actually, let's do 3 seconds. So with this layer selected, I'm going to go ahead and hit the left bracket key on the keyboard, and that will line my layer up to where my time slider is, our current time indicator. So now what's happening is I get to have a little bit more visual interest since this shot is pretty long. First I have this car pass by, the guy on the bicycle, then as they go off screen, red car comes into frame, they go off screen, and now my red car is completely in focus, so I have time to just look at this by itself. And I'm not getting too many interruptions by having multiple things passing at once. Okay, so you can see this layer by itself does not look very impressive, but this is just the plain color layer. This tells After Effects what color my car is basically going to be. So now that I have that in, I can go ahead and start dropping in the rest of my layers. Let's go ahead and put the road shadow in. And this should basically go underneath the diffuse because that shadow should be showing up behind the car. And I gotta make sure that both of these layers are lined up at the same time, because you can see that shadow's floating off over here by itself. So I'm gonna go to 3 seconds on the timeline. You can see it reads it here. And again, hit the left bracket so that they're both lined up. So now when I scroll through, you can see that my shadow is matching up with my diffuse. So this is the shadow that the car casts onto the road. And you can see right now that it's a little bit dark. So what you want to do is, typically I like to use other points of the footage to compare to when doing some color correcting or compositing. And I can see that the shadow here that the car is casting onto the road is basically the same color that's being cast from the trees onto the road. Now it gets a little bit darker when I get shadow on top of shadow. So that gives me a little bit of information about how that shadow needs to look. Now it doesn't get too much darker, but it's just slightly darker. So that means that I'm going to need to take this road shadow. I'll press T to open up the opacity properties, and I need to bring it down. Now the other problem here is that I'm also getting a really hard edge. So that's when I can go into Effects, Blur and Sharpen, and add some Gaussian blur. Gaussian blur basically just gives me a good all-around blur on the entire image. So I'll just go ahead and pump this up. Something that looks just a little bit softer here, maybe something like an 8. I could go farther with it. Again, this is where you're going to want to use your better judgment for what looks good. Let's go ahead and lighten that up. I want it to be just a little bit darker, but not too much. So maybe I'll go to something like 50. Maybe even 48, just to bring it down a notch. Alright, so let's go ahead and close our effects panel, go back to the project panel, and continue bringing in our different render layers. So the next one I'm going to bring in is the occlusion layer. This is our dirt pass layer. Again, I'm going to bring this in. Now this layer needs to go above the diffuse layer. The reason that the order of these layers is also so important is because we have to use our blending modes to get these to actually match up correctly. So the order that these are in is going to make a big difference as to how our blending modes are going to function. So again, let's go ahead and make sure that these layers are all matched up at the same time. I'll go to 3 seconds on the timeline, press the left bracket, and now you can see they're matching up. Oh, looks like we have a missing frame there, so I'll have to go back and correct that. Okay, so this is what the occlusion pass looks like by itself without having any blending modes. You can see that I get this white area, and I basically get a black and sort of gray area. Now, in order to use my blending layers for the occlusion pass, what I'm going to want to do here is set this to multiply. And now I get rid of all of the white areas, but I keep all of the dark areas, including sort of this gradation from the ground up on the car. So without the occlusion pass, this is what the car looks like, and the ground also. So it's very flat. With the occlusion pass, it gives me a little bit more grain, a little bit more grit, and a little bit of dirt information as well. So you can see how this is going to make quite a bit of difference to, adding the believability of this car. So we're basically just layering in pieces and parts of the images. Now, the only thing on this is, again, we're getting a little bit too dark of a shadow underneath the car. I don't need it to be as light as the part of the car that's casting a shadow onto the ground, but it's still a little bit too dark. I shouldn't have complete black underneath. So I'll probably just need to bring this down a notch. Maybe something down to 78. Again, I can eyeball this, and sometimes once you're done layering in all your layers, you'll see that there still needs to be some adjustments made on each of these occlusion, diffuse, or road shadow layers. Alright, so next let's go ahead and do our... Well, I'll leave the full car reflection for last. So let's go ahead and put in the car shadow. And this one will go over the occlusion layer. Again, let's go ahead and match this up. So let's go to 3 seconds, press left bracket on the keyboard. And now you can see what I'm getting is my car is looking pretty dark. But if I pull this back to where the car sort of passes through the light, you can see how that shadow layer is basically telling the car when it's in light and when it's not in light. So again, this is where I need to use a blending mode. And for our car shadow, I'm going to go ahead and set this to overlay. So now you can see that shadow is going to be a lot more apparent when he's past the light layer. You can see it becomes a lot darker. When he goes back into the light, you can see it becomes a lot lighter. So we can actually see him coming in and out of the light. And again, we might need to bring the opacity of this down a little bit so it's not so dark. For now, I'll just bring it down to something like 60. And then once I'm done compositing everything in, I can see if there's any adjustments that need to be made. Okay, so before we get to our final layer, let's go ahead and put in our specular. Our specular is our highlight layer, so this tells After Effects where the highlights on the car are. If I go to 2 seconds or 3 seconds, gonna go ahead and press the left bracket to line up my layer so that they're all starting and ending at the same time. And you can see that the specular layer by itself, the transparent areas will be black and the areas that are not supposed to be transparent will be white. So you can see where the highlights on this car are showing up, and as the car moves, the parts that are highlighted change over time. So just so we can get a good view of this, let me go to somewhere around 6 seconds and 28 frames. And the blending mode we'll want to use for adding specular is we could either use a screen, which still leaves a little bit of that black information, or I can use add, which gets rid of more of the black and keeps the white areas. Again, this is like something we would use for fire. If you want to keep the light, you use an add or a screen, and if you want to get rid of the black areas, and again, that's those either add or screen would be what the render layers that you would want, or the blending modes that you would want to use. Okay, so it's starting to look a lot better, almost convincing. So the last layer that we need to put in here is our full car reflection layer. And this is the one that basically gives it all the pizzazz and makes it look completely believable. So again, if we go to 3 seconds, let's match this layer up and bring this in. Now one thing happened when I rendered this out, so it looks like somehow my reflection layer got a little bit squeezed, and I think this might have happened when I re-rendered it out of After Effects. So what we'll have to do is make up for some of the errors that happened in here, and often this happens in compositing. So I